Welcome to the last session of the OpenNebulaCon2023. We're going to have a conversation about the future of the sovereign cloud. In this exclusive interview with Alfons Buxó, a global cloud transformation leader at Deloitte, we will discuss how the concept of cloud sovereignty has become a top concern not only to the governments and public agencies, but also for private industries operating in many sectors. I remind the attendees that you can send your questions through the chat. I'd like to thank the sponsors of the OpenNebulaCon2023 for their participation in this year's event. Now let's give a warm welcome to Alfons Buxó.
Hi, Alfonso, and thank you for having me here.
Now, Alfons, after more than a decade in which it seemed that everything had to be on the public cloud, how do you understand the role that private clouds keep playing within public agencies and private organizations?
Well, Alfonso, definitely technology is about balance. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all delivery model that can cope with every and single possible use case. So if we're looking backwards, organizations were designing private clouds in order to have a kind of public cloud experience on-prem, mimicking the same agility, but under the IT controller. So it was not about the scale, it was not about the innovation. I think that now organizations, they understand better implications, specifically about data, what is the confidentiality, the sensitivity levels, and that is becoming a key criteria to pick a preferred delivery model, either if it's public or it has to be private. And regulation and compliance is pushing as well the idea that this has to be very well defined, especially for critical sectors. Public is one of them, not the only one, and defense, absolutely.
Okay, but when considering that companies have moved to the public cloud, right now, it's our understanding and that companies are worried about vendor lock-in. Really, how critical is it for them to have access to middleware platforms, minimizing their dependency on the usual cloud providers?
Well, we've been living with vendor lock-in since the very beginning. It's impossible to have an organization that is absolutely not dependent on any technology. The question is that we need to be very specific in terms of when is something that it has to be avoided. As an example, having a vendor lock-in in a commodity layer, it makes no sense. Or when the organization realizes that there is a vendor lock-in, but there is a value that requires to accept it and to define an exit strategy. A lot of companies, they are targeting as container as a service as their layer for getting independence among vendors, and that's okay. They are avoiding the majority of the locking at the infra level, but at some cost. And the cost is not leveraging the platform where the innovation really lays. Some others are defining a platform of choice that it might be deployed within the containers and basically using and leveraging standard components. To me, is really critical that companies are looking carefully at the middleware platforms to understand what is the value and what are the trade-offs. And that requires a thoughtful analysis on pros and cons.
Okay. And that some technology vendors promote a concept of cloud sovereignty that focuses only on the data layer, either in terms of geographical location or encryption capabilities. But really, how do you see the role of open source in expanding that concept to the whole cloud technology stack?
Well, I understand why the sovereignty concept coming from some vendors focus just on the data layer, on the encryption, on data locality or data residence as main arguments, because that is what they can address. The sovereignty concept is broader than that. and embraces the impact of control in all layers related to a service. So from operations to data to platforms and even to infra. And it might be relevant or not depending on the use case, the type of sector, and the type of data that we are looking at. But definitely it's not about just location, even the regulation space. So if it's just within the union. And organizations, they must look carefully at the level of control and dependencies that they may accept in order to deliver successfully their mission. So what's the role of open source here? And I think it has to play, and is playing a critical role. And is basically allowing entities to minimize those dependencies. It allows faster innovation, more than what any organization alone they can do. It allows forks if the community is not driving the functionality in the direction that that public sector organization needs. So it allows that freedom. And definitely it has to be built on top of communities that are in your region of interest. That's key, because it's not just using the open source, is basically having the talent and the knowledge to evolve that moving forward.
And following to the concerns that we just talked about, there are also some concerns about how big tech corporations have gradually taken control of many critical open source projects. You can see it, with many examples around. Do you think the European industry is ready to step in and start building together the open source cloud and edge technologies that nowadays the European market demands?
Well, it's absolutely true that some key global players, many of them are headquartered outside the EU. But the question, Alfonso, is not if we are ready or not, is that if we may accept technology dependence moving forward. Because in a digital economy, we will need as much IP as possible in order to compete effectively in the global markets. And we know that the majority of the IP is happening in the US and China, but not in Europe. So while the European Union is not going to be able to create, at least in the short term, a kind of global player that it can compete effectively with the well-established incumbent players, I think that it can incentivize and promote open source technologies that are led within the European Union. And an interesting case is edge. So edge computing is something that is being built as we speak, and there are going to be different stakeholders and probably more smaller players and a more federated environment, maybe, that might work in the EU. So we are not late in that sense yet. But definitely, I think that the European industry has no option, and we need to move aggressively with the right investments to create that IP and the talent that we need on that.
Okay, so Alfonso, one last question. How do you expect the public sector and those companies operating in the aeronautics and defense sectors to contribute, to the adoption and development of sovereign European open source solutions?
So, well, I think that probably we need to look at first, those are the kind of customers that are ticking all the boxes. So if we are looking in terms of sovereignty, data, relevance of the service, need for control, so definitely that probably is the sweet spot. I think that we should pay attention in terms of to history and what the US did exactly for the same purpose a decade ago. And they invested public money heavily in private companies to create the traction and building the market for them. So I'm not going to name a specific company, but we need to realize that back in 2012, where almost every company that was a public cloud provider were struggling and losing a lot of money, Well, U.S. federal government invested $500 million to create I would say a public cloud, a virtual private cloud for the CIA, and that was one example. That is something that the public sector in Europe is not used to, but probably we need to revisit this kind of uh, approximation, because probably what we have to do is to replicate what worked well for the US. The question is that military and aeronautics are the two industries that they are more sensible. They have huge budgets, and I think that they need to foster open source in order to have an ecosystem that is pushing innovation, but is open and that we can let and evolve. That to me has to be one of the outcomes that we in public sector as Europeans we can drive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Alfons, that it's the public sector, the one that has to really push for the industry to follow, and defense and aeronautics is a good example, because most of it is public sector investment, except that we have to take advantage and really put the money where it's needed. Thank you again, Alfons, for your kind participation and answering all these questions. We'll see if we have any question from the audience. Let's wait a couple of seconds.
Okay.
Oh, sure. Here we have one. Alfons, this one for you. How do you see the strategy of the European Commission in terms of supporting the development of European open source?
Well, it's a tricky one. What I would say is that the European Commission is fully aware of what the situation is and the issues that we are facing as a union. So that is good, because in order to solve any problem, we need to realize that there is a problem to be solved. In terms of supporting development of European open source, I think that they are all in. So it's not a matter of direction, it's a matter of the details on how to make that happen. We are seeing more and more requirements in tenders and in projects that they are asking explicitly, and it's a must, to deliver the solutions leveraging open source, and that open source they should be delivered by talent within the union. So it's not about global factories or people that are abroad, but specifically about talent that is within the union. So I'm optimistic that I think that we are trying to address. As somebody told me once, we are in the right direction at the wrong speed. So my message to the union is that we need to speed up, and we need to be more bold in terms of accomplishing this.
Good. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then, we have another question. How critical is it to get US hyperscalers somehow involved in supporting the development of those new European open source cloud and edge technologies?
Well, definitely yes, because on the centralized public clouds, we've not in a top position, I would say, from Europe. I think that getting those vendors aligned and supportive, it's highly needed. I wouldn't say that it's critical in the sense that without them, this is not going to happen. This is going to happen if the EU wants it to happen. What I would say is that based on regulation and compliance, what we might influence is the way these vendors are developing solutions and how they need to embrace as well solutions being built within the union, probably for IoT, for some specific cases like connected car or others that while the data probably in those cases is going to be in some public vendors, that data for sure, even that is not under GDPR, we are going to face more and more data that being not personal, it has to be compliant and it has to be sitting within the EU soil. So my point is that it's desirable and I think that through regulation we might accomplish part of that, and that the AWS, the Googles, and the Microsoft of the world, they need to be more open up to this kind of approach.
Great. Before we move to the next question, I want to make a point in something that you answered a couple of questions ago about the participation of the U.S. federal government on enticing, helping the big tech companies in the U.S. to really not for them to lose the way they come out to the market, and how public money is pumped into these organizations to be leaders on their sectors. Something that the European Union nowadays is little, there's a reticence, is that word, or maybe And I think we have to make it clear that public money is needed for the industry to thrive.
I think that you are spot on. So if we look at the history in the US, even with the birth of Silicon Valley. So I worked for Hewlett Packard for 20 years. I live in the US, and if we are looking at what Silicon Valley was in the 50s, it was just agriculture. There was not many other things. And Hewlett Packard, right? That was put there in 1939. But it was the Defense Department that they invested a huge amount of money with Fairchild to create the semiconductor industry. And that led to Intel in the 70s, in the early 70s. So I think that the US has been using public money to strengthen and to develop public sectors that they think are critical and that they are strategic. And I think technology, by all means, is one of them. When we came to the cloud scene in the mid 2000s, so AWS was built in 2006. We need to remind ourselves that for the first years they were losing a huge amount of money every year. So the cash flow was negative to the extent of almost $1 billion per year. So without help from public sector, it would have been really tough to develop these kind of champions. We've seen now in the GDI program from the Defense Department, at the same they invested 10 billion between some cloud vendors in the US. So I think that US has no issues with this, and they are not reluctant and very bold in terms of growing their strategic industries around digital economies. I think that the EU has to play with the same tools. Otherwise, we are always going to be, in a disadvantage. And I think that the time is now. We know that we want to grow the digital economy in the EU, and definitely we need to replicate what has worked well for the US. And China is even worse, right? So if we're looking at Huawei or or Ali Cloud, is the same. So I think that it's fine to play nice, but we need to be very effective in terms of how we want to position the European Union in the coming years.
Yeah, because we're lagging behind several years on development. We have a lot of ground to cover and catch up, and that's how we. Open source is going to be it's a great way to do it, because innovation and development is faster when you have a thriving open source community. But open source never means free. It means that somebody has to sponsor it.
But that's an interesting point. I'm afraid that there is no alternative for the EU. So we cannot invest in having closed source from a specific company that they can compete at the same rhythm and with the same level of innovation that the well-established players that they've been doing this for decades. I think that the only way that the EU can bridge the gap, the sooner the better, is through open source, because you are leveraging the innovation that is happening around the world, and what you have to develop are communities that they can improve that technology but based out of the EU. Because one of the comments that we talk about in one of the questions was, what happens with the open source communities that are driven by a company that is private and is headquartered somewhere else? So, and basically it's about interest in the way how you want to develop that technology. And we need to make sure that the technologies are developed taking into account the EU principles and the EU needs.
Well, that was the last question. Thank you very much, Alfons, for participating, and hope to have you around for next year's OpenNebulaConf.
It has been my absolute pleasure. Looking forward to it, Alfonso.
Bye to the whole audience. Thank you very much for participating and attending.